The room went dead silent when they called his name. Harold's 24-year-old son, Drew, barely 3 months on the job, couldn't even explain what a TEU was, and there I was having to clap for him. After 7 years of keeping Pacific Harbor Freight running through every crisis they threw at me, they expected me to smile while they handed this kid the position I'd earned. I'm Keith Morrison, 48, and that moment changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty and hard work. Let me tell you how I got to that conference room. 7 years ago, I needed this job bad. My divorce had cleaned me out, and I had my daughter Sarah's college fund to rebuild. She was 11 then, and I was determined to give her the stability I couldn't provide during those final years of my marriage. Pacific Harbor Freight wasn't my dream job, but it was steady work in an industry I understood. Maritime logistics isn't glamorous, but it's the backbone of everything that moves through the Pacific Northwest ports. I knew freight operations from my previous job at a smaller carrier, so the learning curve wasn't steep. What surprised me was how quickly people started coming to me instead of management when things went wrong. Within my first 6 months, I was the guy they called for the problems nobody else wanted to touch. Shipment stuck at the port of Tacoma because of a customs documentation error? I knew which inspector handled intermodal transfers and could get it moving. Clients screaming about a delayed container from Long Beach? I had the dispatch manager's direct line and could track the exact vessel location. The real test came during my first year when that warehouse fire in Spokane shut down our northern distribution routes overnight. While everyone else was still trying to figure out which carriers serviced our backup routes, I had 3 alternative distribution lines mapped out in 4 hours. I pulled up our carrier contracts, cross-referenced their coverage areas with our client delivery zones, and had trucks rolling before the fire department finished their initial assessment. I wasn't trying to be the hero, I just did what needed doing. But after a while, I realized I'd become the guy they called when everything else failed. Harold Brooks, our 53-year-old regional VP, definitely noticed. Every performance review was spotless. Every year-end meeting ended with him saying something like, "Keith, just hang tight, your time's coming. I'm watching how you handle these situations." And I believed him. What choice did I have? I had a mortgage on a 3-bedroom house in Renton, a teenager who needed to see her dad wasn't a complete failure, and bills that didn't care about my feelings. Harold knew all this. He knew about the divorce settlement that took half my assets. He knew I needed the health insurance for Sarah's asthma medication. He knew I wouldn't rock the boat because I couldn't afford to start over again at 41. For 7 years, that arrangement worked perfectly for him. I became the guy who knew every port director from Seattle to San Diego by their first name. I memorized vessel schedules, tracked weather patterns that could delay shipments, spotted port congestion before it became a crisis. When Harold walked into board meetings with solutions to problems they didn't even know existed yet, it was because I'd already figured out the fix and handed it to him on a silver platter. He loved taking credit for my work. I told myself I didn't mind as long as the division ran smoothly and my paycheck cleared every 2 weeks. The important thing was keeping our clients happy, maintaining our port relationships, and making sure Pacific Harbor stayed competitive in an industry where one missed delivery could cost you $1 million contract. The warning signs were there if I'd been paying attention. That second desk that appeared in Harold's office about 8 months ago, the closed-door meetings that suddenly didn't include me, even when they were discussing operational changes I'd have to implement. The way conversations stopped when I walked into the break room. But I kept my head down and did my job because I thought loyalty still mattered in corporate America. I thought if you worked hard enough, showed up every day, solved problems without complaining, eventually someone would notice. I thought Harold's promises about my future meant something. I thought the relationships I'd built with clients like Peterson Freight and the trust I'd earned from port authorities would translate into advancement opportunities. Then Drew Brooks walked through our doors like he owned the place. Perfect suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. Perfect smile. Perfect confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. Harold introduced him during our Monday morning meeting like we were meeting the future of the company instead of a recent college graduate with a generic business degree and 0 experience in freight logistics. "He's here to learn our operations," Harold announced, practically glowing with pride as he put his hand on his son's shoulder. "I want everyone to show him how Pacific Harbor runs. The kid was supposed to shadow me for his first few weeks, and within an hour, I knew we were in serious trouble. His first question was how many packages we processed daily. Packages. We moved container freight across ocean routes, not packages. When I explained the difference between maritime shipping and parcel delivery, he nodded like he understood, then asked how many trucks we owned. We didn't own trucks. We contracted with motor carriers for inland transportation. Drew wasn't stupid, just completely unprepared for this industry. But he took notes like his life depended on it, writing down everything I said even when half of it went over his head. He sat in on client calls with Peterson Freight and our other major accounts, scribbling frantically whenever someone mentioned technical terms like demurrage charges or container dwell time. Every time he'd glance up at me with this eager expression, like he expected praise for paying attention. I tried teaching him, really tried. During his first week, I walked him through the basics of container capacity, explaining how a standard 40-foot container could hold 26 pallets, but you had to factor in weight distribution and cargo compatibility. I showed him our port congestion tracking system, how weather delays in Long Beach could ripple through our entire West Coast network. I explained the delicate relationships with motor carriers that kept our supply chains moving smoothly. Some of it stuck, but not enough. He'd remember that Peterson Freight was our biggest coastal account, but forget that they specialized in automotive parts requiring specific temperature controls. He knew we used third-party logistics providers, but couldn't distinguish between a freight forwarder and a customs broker. When clients called with urgent issues, he'd put them on hold and come find me with this panicked look. Still, Harold talked about him like he was some kind of prodigy. Fresh perspective, Harold called it during our weekly management meetings, even though Drew's most insightful observation in 6 weeks was asking why cargo ships couldn't just take more direct routes to avoid storm systems. I had to explain ocean currents, fuel efficiency, and port scheduling windows while Harold nodded approvingly like his son had asked a brilliant strategic question. The tension didn't explode all at once. It seeped into the cracks slowly, changing the office dynamics in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. Drew started appearing in executive meetings he had no business attending. When Harold discussed our quarterly logistics performance with the board, Drew was there taking notes on conversations that required years of experience to understand. Decisions I normally had input on started going through Drew first. Our dispatcher would ask, "Has Drew approved the Peterson Freight routing changes?" Before implementing schedules I'd been managing successfully for years. People who used to come directly to me with operational questions now asked, "Should we run this by Drew?" Like approval from someone who didn't understand the difference between break bulk cargo and containerized freight suddenly mattered more than 7 years of proven results. I felt the ground shifting under me every day, small changes that accumulated until the whole office atmosphere felt different, less collaborative, more careful. People worried about what they said around Drew, not because they respected his expertise, but because they were afraid of what his last name could cost them if he repeated their comments to Harold. The most frustrating part was watching Drew try to contribute to discussions he wasn't qualified to join. During a meeting about expanding our Seattle to Portland trucking capacity, he suggested we could save money by using smaller vehicles for partial loads. I had to explain that LTL shipping was already factored into our rate structures and that breaking down full container loads would actually increase costs due to additional handling and documentation requirements. Harold praised Drew's innovative thinking while I bit my tongue and wondered how much longer I could watch this performance. Every week, Drew's confidence grew while his actual competence remained stuck at beginner level. He started offering opinions about carrier negotiations he'd never participated in and port relationships he didn't understand. The breaking point almost came during a crisis with our Vancouver route. A longshoreman strike was backing up container traffic, and we had 3 Peterson Freight shipments stuck in customs. Drew suggested we just reroute through the port of Tacoma without understanding that cross-border freight requires different documentation and that Tacoma didn't have the specialized automotive handling equipment Peterson's cargo required. I spent 16 hours straight working with our customs broker to get temporary storage authorization and coordinate with alternative carriers who could handle temperature-sensitive automotive components. Drew watched me make call after call, negotiate emergency rates, and coordinate with port authorities to expedite clearance procedures. When it was over and Peterson's cargo was moving again, Harold thanked both of us like we'd contributed equally to solving the problem. That's when I started noticing the subtle changes in how Harold discussed my future. Instead of saying when you move up, he started saying as you develop your leadership skills. Instead of concrete promises about advancement, he offered vague comments about broadening your experience base and learning to delegate more effectively. Meanwhile, Drew was getting exposure to areas of the business I'd never been invited to explore. Harold took him to board meetings, introduced him to executives from other divisions, included him in strategic planning sessions that had nothing to do with day-to-day operations. It was like watching someone else get fitted for a suit that had been tailored for me. The morning of the announcement, I walked into the office sensing something different in the air. People were giving me these encouraging little smiles, the kind you give someone right before they get good news. Janet from accounting stopped by my desk to say how much she appreciated everything I'd done for the company. Miguel from the dock supervisors made a point of shaking my hand and saying I deserved recognition for my hard work. I let myself believe, just for a few hours, that maybe this was finally my moment. Maybe Harold had decided that merit mattered more than family connections. Maybe the board had insisted on promoting the person who actually knew how to run the division. I even allowed myself to imagine how I'd restructure our West Coast operations once I had the authority to implement the improvements I'd been proposing for years. When Harold called the meeting for 10 a.m., I thought I was walking into my promotion ceremony. I prepared talking points about expanding our Asian trade routes and modernizing our cargo tracking systems. I was ready to thank Harold for his mentorship and promise the board that their confidence in me wouldn't be misplaced. Instead, I was about to learn exactly how naive I'd been about the way the world really worked. I walked into the conference room expecting our routine quarterly update, ready to present the coastal distribution improvements I'd been working on for months. The room felt different, though, charged with anticipation. People looked at me with small smiles and encouraging nods. I let myself think for one moment that maybe this was finally it. Then Harold walked in with Drew right behind him. The kid was flushed with excitement, clutching a folder like it contained the script for his future. Something went numb in my chest. Harold cleared his throat, doing that dramatic pause thing he loved when he wanted the room's full attention. Before we begin our quarterly review, I have an important announcement to make. Every eye in the room shifted between him and me. I felt heat creeping up my neck. Harold placed his hand on Drew's shoulder, smiling like a man announcing his son's wedding. Effective immediately, Drew Brooks will be stepping into the role of Regional Operations Director. The words didn't register at first. My brain refused to process what my ears had heard. Drew blinked rapidly, looking as stunned as I felt despite clearly knowing this was coming. Then the applause started, scattered at first, then building into this forced, uncomfortable rhythm. I sat there completely frozen. 7 years of crisis management, midnight phone calls, missed weekends, and quiet victories that kept this company profitable. None of it mattered. I forced my hands to move, clapping along with everyone else while my career collapsed around me. Drew's smile stretched wide and trembling. Every bit of his body language showed he was as overwhelmed as he was delighted. He'd been here barely 3 months. He still called customs brokers shipping agents and thought demurrage charges were optional fees. And there he was, accepting congratulations for a job he'd never done, stepping into a future I'd spent nearly a decade building. Harold beamed at him like a man who believed he'd made a bold, visionary choice. Then he turned toward me and I thought maybe he'd offer some explanation, some gesture that would make this betrayal sting less. Instead, he said, "I want to acknowledge Keith Morrison, who has been invaluable in getting Drew up to speed these past few months." Up to speed. Like my entire career had been nothing more than a training program for his son. Like 7 years of expertise was just preparation for this moment. I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. The room buzzed with polite congratulations that nobody really meant. People shook Drew's hand and offered praise they didn't believe. When the meeting finally ended, I gathered my notebook slowly, trying to keep my hands steady. People filtered out, some patting Drew on the back, others avoiding eye contact with me entirely. I started to leave when Harold caught my arm. "Keith, stick around for a moment," he said, lowering his voice like he expected gratitude for the humiliation he'd just delivered. The room emptied until it was just the two of us. Harold leaned against the table, loosening his tie as if he were the one who'd endured something exhausting. "I know this might come as a surprise," he said, "but Drew brings fresh perspective. You understand, right? It's nothing personal. Nothing personal. Promoting his inexperienced son over the person who'd practically run the division for years wasn't personal. I stared at him, letting the silence stretch until he looked uncomfortable. I understand perfectly, I said. And I did. I saw exactly what this was and what my future looked like if I stayed. I went back to my desk after that, moving on autopilot like people do after accidents when they're still trying to process what happened. My coworkers avoided looking at me too long, afraid they'd accidentally reveal how they really felt. Angry for me, relieved it wasn't them, terrified of the politics beneath it all. I held myself together through the rest of the day, but something inside me had gone very still. Not defeated, just sharply awake to reality I'd been ignoring for too long. I stayed late that night, partly because I didn't want to go home with this humiliation still burning in my chest, and partly because work had always been where I felt most in control. By 8 p.m., the office was empty except for the cleaning crew humming quietly through the hallways. I was heading to the break room for coffee when I heard voices from Harold's office. Low, tense, unmistakably private. The door was cracked open just enough for sound to slip through. I should have kept walking, but something told me this conversation was about me. The board's going to ask questions, a man was saying. Glenn Parker, our corporate liaison. Drew's only been here 3 months. His resume is basically blank. Harold let out that breathy laugh he used when trying to sound confident about something that worried him. They'll get over it. He's family, and he has the degree. Fresh thinking is what this division needs. What about Keith Morrison? He's been running this division quietly for years. Didn't you tell the board he was your strongest internal candidate? Silence stretched for several seconds. Then Harold said, Keith's reliable, but he's not leadership material. My stomach dropped. Reliable. Like a piece of functioning equipment. Glenn didn't sound convinced. His experience outweighs Drew's entire background. The clients trust him personally. Experience is fine, Harold said, but Keith won't go anywhere. Divorced. Mortgage. Child support payments. He needs this job more than we need to worry about his feelings. He'll keep his head down like he always does. The words burned in my ears. He wasn't evaluating my work. He was calculating my desperation, using my responsibilities as chains to keep me compliant. He'll fall in line, Harold added with complete confidence. He always does. That's why he's perfect for supporting Drew through the transition. Fall in line. Not a performance review, but a prediction. A sentence handed down without my knowledge based on assumptions about how trapped I was. I backed away from the doorway, my hands cold despite the heated office. I didn't feel humiliated anymore. What I felt was absolute clarity about who Harold Brooks really was and what my future looked like if I stayed. By Friday afternoon, the clarity from that overheard conversation had hardened into something unshakable. I printed my resignation letter on thick paper, the kind people use for real decisions, not impulsive ones. The whole morning felt strangely calm, like the quiet before a storm that only I knew was coming. When the clock hit 4:30, I walked toward Harold's office. He'd just finished giving Drew another tour of what he loudly called your new domain. The phrase still made me sick. I knocked. Harold looked up with that managerial smile he used when he wanted to appear approachable. Keith, come in. How's the transition going? I handed him the envelope. This is my 2 weeks' notice. The smile died instantly. His eyebrows shot up, then pulled together into an expression I'd never seen on him before. Fear. This is about the promotion, he said, tearing open the envelope. Not a question. This is overdue, I replied. He read it twice, fast the first time and slower the second. His throat worked like he was trying to swallow something bitter. Keith, you're making a rash decision. What about your responsibilities? Your mortgage? Sarah's college fund? You need stability. There it was. His supposed leverage, my life weaponized to keep me compliant. I'll manage, I said. Harold paced behind his desk, agitation growing with each step. You realize quitting over this makes you look unprofessional. You're throwing away everything you've built here. I kept my expression flat, letting him hear how pathetic he sounded. He tried a different approach, leaning forward like we were old friends. Look, Keith, I can't give you a strong reference if you walk out like this. Think about your future. 7 years of flawless performance reviews, and now he was pretending I was a liability. A reference won't be necessary, I said. Monday morning proved how wrong he was about Drew being ready. I found the kid at his desk by 6 a.m., surrounded by printouts and half-finished emails, looking like he'd aged 5 years over the weekend. "Keith," he whispered, panic barely contained. "Something's wrong with our Peterson freight shipment. Customs flagged the manifest and they're threatening to cancel their contract if we don't fix it today." Peterson, our largest coastal account. The same client who'd told me years earlier, "Keith, if you ever leave this company, we're in serious trouble." I spent 3 hours untangling the mess. Drew had used an outdated customs form, referenced the wrong carrier in the documentation, and hadn't coordinated with our freight forwarder about the temperature-controlled requirements. By noon, we'd resolved the crisis, but the damage was already spreading. 4 major clients called that day asking the same question. "Keith, are you still managing our account?" When I told them I'd be leaving in less than 2 weeks, every conversation ended with uncomfortable silence, then barely concealed concern about their future service levels. Word travels fast in our industry. By Wednesday, I had calls from competitors who'd heard about Pacific Harbor's situation. By Thursday, Eric Reynolds from Ocean West Logistics wanted an immediate meeting. When I walked into his office overlooking Elliott Bay, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Keith, we've heard what's happening at Pacific Harbor. If you're open to it, we'd like you to lead our Northwest operations." The offer was everything Harold had promised but never delivered. 30% salary increase, full benefits package, tuition support for Sarah, and the authority to build the division the way it should be run. "We're not hiring your resume," Eric said. "We're hiring your reputation." No one had ever said that to me before. I accepted that afternoon. Within a week, 3 major clients reached out to Ocean West requesting to transfer their accounts to my management. Not because I recruited them, but because they trusted me more than they trusted Pacific Harbor's promises. In our industry, trust moves contracts fast. The results spoke for themselves. Ocean West's Northwest Division grew 42% in 6 months. Our port relationships strengthened. Our carrier network expanded, and Eric promoted 2 team members under me because good leadership multiplies opportunities for everyone. Meanwhile, Pacific Harbor began unraveling exactly the way Harold thought it never would. Drew tried his best, but he was drowning in responsibilities he wasn't prepared to handle. Clients complained about missed shipments, misfiled customs documents, delayed carrier payments, problems that would never have happened under my management. The Port of Tacoma disaster hit the trade publications first. An entire Peterson freight shipment locked down because of unauthorized routing changes that violated automotive transport regulations. Then came the breach of contract lawsuit. Finally, the board investigation that Harold never saw coming. 10 months after I left, Eric dropped a copy of Maritime Logistics Weekly on my desk. Page 2, headline, "Pacific Harbor Freight loses 59% regional revenue, VP terminated." Harold had been fired publicly and aggressively. According to the article, Drew resigned shortly afterward and returned to university for a proper logistics certification. He wasn't the villain. He was collateral damage from his father's arrogance. I read the piece twice, then closed the magazine. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. The best revenge wasn't destroying them. It was building something better somewhere else, and watching the industry recognize what Harold had thrown away. 18 months later, I was in Tacoma for a client meeting when I spotted Drew in a coffee shop, bent over textbooks with a highlighter in his hand. He looked older, humbled by experience. When he saw me, he stood up. "Keith, hey." Awkward, but genuine. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. Dad convinced me I was ready, but I never belonged in that role. I studied his face and saw something I respected. Not guilt about being chosen, but understanding about being used. "You were put in an impossible position," I said. "That wasn't your fault." He nodded, eyes getting glassy. "Dad still blames you for what happened. I think losing you is what really broke the company." I paid for both our coffees before leaving. Walking back to my truck, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory, not revenge, just closure. Sometimes the real justice isn't watching someone fall. It's knowing you finally rose to where you belonged,